I don't think it's too kooky to claim that what we're doing in this course by reading McLuhan, Postman, and Nicholas Carr's The Shallows is Marxist, in the sense that what those people are doing and trying to pursue is a certain strand in the sort of post-Marxist understanding of human beings. Of course, Marxism is essentially, at its core, is a political doctrine, an economic one, but especially a political one. It advocates a certain political program of communism, which is essentially the abolition of private property, the elimination of the conditions under which people's labor can be exploited by other people, the elimination of economic classes, etc. Which is, that's fine, to be a Marxist as far as I'm concerned. A very complicated history of communism in the 20th century, but that's not the aspect. If we can separate that out from some other things in Marx, certainly there's nothing revolutionary about, politically revolutionary or orthodox Marxist about McLuhan, Postman, or Carr. What I mean to say is that they're following in a tradition that was more or less established by Marx, which said what? Well, the excerpt I've given you from the German Ideology, early work of Marx, very philosophical, ambitious work, basically said that you cannot understand human beings unless you understand the material form of life that they live in. That is, for him, the most important thing was, how do human beings produce things? How do they reproduce themselves and their lives? What do they do? How do they labor? If one form of producing things will result in one form of human relations, and that form of human relations will structure all thought. The transition from feudalism to capitalism being the most prominent thing in Marx's mind. In his time, he was looking around the world and realizing it was being transformed by industrial capitalism. In the first part of the 19th century, this was obvious to him that society was changing because the way that we produce things was changing. We were moving from an agricultural to an industrial economy. The average person was no longer a subsistence farmer, but a factory worker. The ruling class was no longer the aristocrats who controlled large amounts of arable land. It were the industrial and commercial classes. And that the values of the society were changing in accordance with that. And that was the real claim of historical materialism. But ideas, values, about all sorts of things, ideas about religion, philosophy, human nature, art, that you couldn't understand a society's ideas in this sense until you understood the forces that shaped consciousness in these societies. That ideas themselves were secondary, that they were not independent. That was the great mistake that Marx thought Hegel made, is that ideas were autonomous and they sort of unfolded with their own logic in history. Whereas Marx would say things like, what he says here, in direct contrast to German philosophy, which descends from heaven to earth, here we ascend from earth to heaven. Heaven to earth would mean heaven being ideas, earth being material life, like how we actually survive, organize ourselves economically. Marx thought that was what came first, material life, and that ideas were secondary. That is, ideas were shaped by that life. Whereas a more idealist or Hegelian approach would say that ideas have their own independence and autonomy. It's an ongoing debate, which side is more important or how they relate. But certainly to be a Marxist in a certain way is to conceive of human beings as changeable, that human beings in the way that they think and feel and perceive are shaped by the conditions under which they live. of course, Marx was talking about the economic conditions. The material, what he calls the material life process. What do you need to do to live? And what sort of relationships does that put you in? A relationship to a tenant, to a landlord who controls the land that you farm, or in the modern period, a relation to the owner of a factory that you depend upon for your wages. That ultimately society was composed of relations of property, and the focus was on economic life. I don't think that McLuhan, for instance, is ignoring that. He's talking about that kind of stuff all the time, and is obviously influenced by Marx in a way that perhaps the other two aren't. But the other two aren't at his level as a philosopher, frankly. I mean, he was a philosopher in a way the other two really weren't. They were cultural critics. But it was McLuhan's sort of emphasis on media as the shaping force rather than the whole of economic life that gave his work its originality. But you can see the heritage, the Marxist heritage. If Marx was saying that we cannot understand at a particular time the way that human beings think and perceive unless we understand how those forms of thinking and perception have been formed by the conditions under which people live, then you can certainly, when we move on to McLuhan, if his point is that we cannot understand ourselves and the way that we think and conceive of the world unless we understand the effects that the media, whether it's print, whether it's widely available print, as in cheap newspapers and periodicals, whether it is the advent of radio and television, and after McLuhan's time, of course, the internet. Basically, the thesis that human beings are shaped in this radical way by the forms of media that are current in their society, and there's really nothing they can do about it, and that they're changed. McLuhan's real point was that the changeover from print to electric media, what he called electronic media, was causing profound changes in human nature, human consciousness. It doesn't take much to see that is essentially a Marxist claim, at least insofar as it's saying that ideas, forms of thinking, consciousness are not autonomous, that they are shaped by other factors. And that if we want to understand human thought and ourselves and the way the world is going, we have to take into consideration these formative factors, in this case, the media. So this is just sort of, read through it's a great passage from German ideology. And again, it in some way, Margolis, in his contemporary work, the living philosopher Joseph Margolis, when he says thinking has a history, and then does something to qualify that, or to say what kind of claim he's making. But just to say that thinking has a history for Margolis is to go against the grain of contemporary philosophy, which kind of ignores that. The idea is that somehow we can come up with notions of truth, rationality, a picture of the world, which somehow is ahistorical, which somehow escapes from the shaping factors of history. Margolis sees as a lost cause, that we have to acknowledge that we are, in our thinking, shaped by historical forces, and that therefore thinking and human consciousness and our conceptions of things like truth, rationality, the good, the beautiful, and perhaps even the picture of the world that's correct, for instance, the one that science tries to paint, that these things can never be seen as finished. If thinking has a history, it will continue to have a history. And the real message is, if we want to understand ourselves and proceed in the most clear way in whatever we're trying to do, we simply have to take these things into account. So this is just a couple of little stuff to sort of give us some context and general background, philosophical background for what we're going to do.